The letter from the lawyer arrived on a Thursday morning, the same day my son-in-law was supposed to be standing at the altar. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Sudbury, the one my late wife picked out at a garage sale on LaSalle Boulevard 32 years ago. The maple had gone dark with age, and I'd meant to refinish it for the better part of a decade. I hadn't. There was a mug of coffee in front of me, still hot enough that the steam curled up toward the ceiling light. I remember that because later I kept coming back to that image, the steam, the quiet house, the sound of nothing. As the moment before, everything I thought I understood turned out to be wrong. My daughter's name is Pamela. She's 41 now, though at the time of all this she'd just turned 39. She married her husband. I'll call him her husband because that's what he was, right up until he wasn't, about 8 years before any of this happened. His name is Garrett. Garrett Ohlett. He came from a French-Canadian family out of North Bay, and when he was 32, he'd started a small logistics company that by the time he was 40 had contracts with 3 of the largest mining operations in northern Ontario. He was, by any reasonable measure, a success. He was also, as I eventually came to understand, a man who had built his entire life on the assumption that other people would clean up his messes. I never entirely trusted Garrett. I want to be honest about that. There was something too smooth about him, the way he laughed a little too easily at his own jokes, the way he could change the subject when you got close to something he didn't want to discuss. My wife, God rest her, she adored him. She said I was just being a stubborn old man and that Pamela was happy, and that was the only thing that mattered. She wasn't wrong about the happy part. My daughter was happy, or at least she looked happy, which in a long marriage sometimes amounts to the same thing and sometimes amounts to nothing at all. My wife passed 4 years before all this happened. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by the following November. After she died, I sold the house on Fielding Road and moved into a smaller place on the edge of town, a bungalow with a yard I could manage on my own. I was 63 by then and recently retired from 30 years as a civil engineer with the city. I had my routines, my coffee, my woodworking in the garage, my Thursday dinners at my son Martin's place across town. I had, I think, made a reasonable peace with being old and alone. Pamela called me every Sunday. That was our arrangement. She and Garrett lived in Toronto by then. They'd moved there when the business expanded, and the calls were my main window into her life. She talked about the kids, their son Owen, who was 7, and their daughter Bea, who was 5, about renovations to the house in Leaside, about her work as a physiotherapist, about ordinary things. I listened and asked questions and tried not to be the kind of father who reads trouble into everything. So I wasn't reading trouble into things the Sunday she called me, about 10 weeks before the lawyer's letter arrived, and sounded slightly off, not sad exactly, distracted. Like she was running 2 conversations at once. I asked if everything was all right, and she said yes, of course. Just tired, Bea had a cold and hadn't been sleeping well. I believed her. That was my first mistake. Though to be fair to myself, I'm not sure knowing the truth earlier would have changed anything. The lawyer's letter told me that Garrett's family, specifically his older brother and his mother, who between them still held a minority stake in Garrett's company through an early investment, had become aware of certain information that they felt required me to be informed of. Given my status as Pamela's next of kin and the father of a minor child involved in what was about to become a legal matter, the letter was 6 pages long and written in the kind of language that turns plain facts into a fog so thick you can lose yourself in it. I read it twice at the kitchen table. Then I called my son Martin. Martin is 56, a practical man, a former paramedic who now runs a safety training company. He has the gift of cutting through things. I read him the relevant sections over the phone, and he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Dad, Garrett's brother is saying the baby isn't Garrett's. The baby." That was the first I'd heard there was a baby. Pamela was pregnant, and she hadn't told me. I sat with that for a while. Martin stayed on the line without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. Outside the window, 2 sparrows were arguing over something in the eaves. I watched them and thought about my wife and thought about Pamela at 7 years old asking me why some birds stayed in Sudbury all winter and some flew away, and I told her the ones who stayed were tougher, and she'd said that was sad, and I hadn't known what to say to that. How far along? I asked Martin. About 5 months, he said, according to the letter. 5 months. The call, 10 weeks ago when she'd sounded distracted. The Sunday before that, and the one before that. I'd been talking to my daughter every week, and she'd been carrying a secret for 5 months, and I hadn't known. The letter explained the rest in its careful, lawyerly way. Garrett had been having an affair with a woman who worked in his company's accounting department, a woman named Sandra, for approximately 2 years. When Sandra had become pregnant, Garrett had initially told her the child was hers to deal with and had offered her a financial settlement to resign from the company and sign an agreement that she would make no claims on him or his estate. Sandra had refused. She had retained a lawyer of her own, and in the process of the legal back and forth that followed, certain communications had come to light, text messages, emails, that made clear to Garrett's brother, who sat on the company board, that Garrett had been moving money out of the business in ways that were not entirely above board, and that some of this money had been used to pay for Sandra's apartment and to fund the settlement offer. Garrett's mother, who was 74 and apparently still had her wits about her, had contacted a family mediator. The mediator had recommended that I be notified before the situation escalated further, given that Pamela had apparently not yet disclosed her pregnancy to her own family. I was, as the letter put it, a relevant stakeholder in the welfare of the minor children involved. I closed the letter and looked at my coffee. Still warm. The steam was gone. I didn't call Pamela that morning. I called her that evening after I'd driven to Martin's and sat with him and his wife for a few hours and eaten something, though I couldn't tell you what. When I called, she answered on the second ring, which meant she was expecting to hear from me. Her voice was careful, controlled. She'd always been like her mother in that way, able to hold herself together when she'd rather not be held together. "Dad," she said, "you got the letter." "I got the letter," I said. There was a silence between us that lasted long enough to feel like its own kind of conversation. Then she said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you." "Tell me now," I said. So she did. She'd found out about Sandra 7 months ago, earlier than the letter had indicated. She'd confronted Garrett and he'd admitted it and begged her to stay, for the children, for the life they built, and she'd agreed to try. Then she'd found out she was pregnant herself. She and Garrett had still been together at the time, making their fragile attempt at repair, and she thought, for a few weeks, that maybe it was a sign that things could be different, that something could still be saved. Then she'd found out about the money, not from the brother, not from a lawyer. She'd found it herself. She worked part-time in the administrative side of the business, had for 3 years, and one afternoon in September, she'd been reconciling some expense reports when she found a set of payments that didn't match any file she could locate. She'd pulled on that thread quietly, carefully, over the course of 3 weeks. By the end, she had a picture of what had been happening that was, in her own words, cleaner and worse than I expected. She hadn't gone to anyone yet. She was still deciding what to do. And then Garrett's brother had apparently found the same thread from his own end, and the lawyers had gotten involved, and now here we were. "He wants me to sign an agreement," she said. "His family's lawyers sent it to my lawyer this week. They want me to agree not to pursue any financial claims against the company in exchange for, they're calling it a settlement. They want to make this quiet." "How much?" I asked. Because that's the question a father asks, even when he knows money is not the actual point. She told me. I won't give the exact figure, but it was enough to take care of her and the children for years. More than enough. The kind of number that makes a person feel the ground shift under them slightly. In exchange, she would sign an NDA covering the financial irregularities. She would not contest the division of business assets, and she would agree to a custody arrangement that gave Garrett generous access to Owen and Bay. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I don't know yet," she said. That's the honest answer. All right, I said. Then we figured out. I drove down to Toronto the following weekend. Pamela met me at the door of the Leaside house, and I thought she looked like she'd been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and was relieved, finally, to have someone else nearby, even if they couldn't take the weight from her. We sat in her kitchen, a new kitchen, renovated the previous year, grey cabinets and quartz countertops, nothing like the maple table in Sudbury, and we talked for most of 2 days. Garrett was not in the house. He'd moved into a furnished rental in Etobicoke 2 months earlier at Pamela's request. He called Owen and Bear every night at 7:30 and came to get them on Sunday afternoons, and from what Pamela described, he was doing all the things a man does when he's trying to perform remorse. Flowers at the door. Texts that began with, "I know I have no right to ask, but," the specific sadness of a person who has confused being caught with having wronged someone. Owen, who was 7, had been told his dad was staying somewhere else for a while because of work. Bayer, who was 5, had accepted this without question, because 5-year-olds accept most things if the adults around them sound calm enough. I watched my grandchildren that weekend and felt something that I don't have a clean word for. Not grief, exactly. Not anger, exactly. Something more like a long, slow sorrow for all the things these kids would eventually have to understand. The question of the pregnancy hung over everything, but we didn't talk about it directly until Sunday morning. Pamela made eggs. We ate. Then she said, without looking up from her plate, the prenatal DNA test came back. I put my fork down. "It's Garrett's," she said. "The baby is his." I sat with that. "Does he know?" "He knows," she said. "His lawyers know. It's in the settlement discussions. And Sandra's baby?" "Sandra's due in March," Pamela said. "Her lawyer is pursuing paternity and support through the court separately. That's their business, not mine." She said it without bitterness, which I thought was more impressive than she perhaps realized. I asked her what she wanted, not about the settlement, but about the baby, about her own child. She finally looked up. "I want this baby," she said. "I decided that a while ago. Whatever else happens, that's not what it's about." I nodded. There wasn't much to say to that. She'd already thought it through and come out the other side, and I wasn't there to second-guess her. The settlement negotiations dragged through October and into November. Pamela's lawyer, a woman named Constance who practiced family and corporate law out of a firm on Bay Street, was good, methodical, unimpressed by Garrett's family money, comfortable with the silence that sometimes wins arguments. She found 2 additional irregularities in the company financials that Pamela's own research had missed. The settlement number went up. Garrett called me once during this period. I want to be accurate about what that conversation was like. He called on a Tuesday evening, and he was careful and composed, the way he always was. And he said he wanted me to know that he still cared about Pamela and the children, and that he hoped we could get through this in a way that was, and I remember this word specifically, constructive. I listened to him, and then I said, "Garrett, you moved money out of your own company to fund an affair and then tried to pay the woman to go away. There's not a constructive frame for that." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he understood. I believed him about that, at least. The papers were signed on a Friday in mid-November. Pamela signed them in Constance's office on Bay Street. I drove down for it and waited in the lobby, sitting in one of those sleek chairs that are designed to look comfortable rather than be comfortable, reading a 2-month-old copy of Maclean's without taking in a word of it. When she came out, she looked tired and clear-eyed at the same time, the way people look when something is finally, actually over. We walked out onto Bay Street together. It was cold, the kind of cold that comes off Lake Ontario and finds the gap between your scarf and your collar no matter how you tie it. The city moved around us the way cities do, indifferent and constant. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Like I've been holding my breath for 6 months," she said, "and I can finally stop." We went and had lunch at a place on King Street that she liked. She had soup, I had a sandwich. We talked about the kids, about her plan to take some time before she went back to work, about Christmas, and whether she wanted to come up to Sudbury or whether I should come down to Toronto. normal things. The kind of talk that signals that life is going to continue, that the machinery of ordinary days is still there and still turning even when you've been away from it for a while. In January, she had the baby, a boy. She named him Arthur, after my father, which she hadn't told me she was going to do. I was in the waiting room at Mount Sinai when the nurse came out to get me, and I went in, and there was my daughter, 39 years old and exhausted and bright-eyed, holding this small red-faced creature wrapped in a hospital blanket. And she looked up at me and said, "Meet Arthur." I'm not a man who cries easily. My generation wasn't raised that way. But I stood there in that hospital room and felt something in my chest give way, the way ice does in April on the lakes up north, and I didn't try to stop it. Garrett visited Arthur in the hospital. I wasn't there for that, but Pamela told me it was brief and civil. He held his son for a few minutes. He didn't cry, as far as she could tell. That seemed right. Somehow, not wrong, not right either. Just the kind of thing that happens when a life has been thoroughly dismantled and what's left is the practical business of going forward. Sandra had her baby in March. A girl. The paternity case was settled out of court, also in March, and Garrett acknowledged the child and agreed to support payments. Pamela told me this the way she told me most things now. Factually, without drama, like someone who has decided that the drama is over and there's no point revisiting it. The company survived. Garrett's brother took a larger role in operations, and there was, apparently, a quiet internal audit that satisfied the board. Whether that audit found everything or only the things people agreed to find, I have no way of knowing. That's not really my concern. I still have my Thursday dinners at Martin's. I still do woodworking in the garage. Last spring, I finally refinished the old maple table, sanded it back to pale wood and put 2 coats of oil on it, and it looks the way it did when my wife brought it home. She would have been pleased with that, I think. She would have said it was about time. Pamela and the children came up to Sudbury for Thanksgiving. Owen is 8 now and spent most of the visit trying to help me in the garage. Bea made herself at home on the sofa with a book, which is very much her way. Arthur, who had just turned 9 months, sat on the kitchen floor and regarded the world with the particular gravity that babies have when they're working out how things fit together. I watched him from across the room and thought about all the things he would eventually know, and all the things he would never know, and all the things that would shape him anyway, invisibly. The way the cold shapes the trees up here, whether or not you're paying attention to it. My daughter came and stood beside me. We didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Thank you for coming to Toronto that day." "Where else would I be?" I said. She put her hand on my arm and we stood there watching her son try to figure out a wooden spoon, and outside the window the maples had gone the full red and gold of a Sudbury October, and I thought, this is what remains. Not the money, not the papers, not the lawyers and the letters and the long, careful negotiations. This, the kitchen, the light, the child on the floor, the fact that she called me, the fact that she told me, the fact that I drove down. That's the part that holds. I've had a lot of time to sit with all of this. Long winters in Sudbury give you that, whether you want it or not. What strikes me most, looking back, isn't the money or the lawyers or the careful language of settlement agreements. It's how long things were quietly rotting before anyone said a word out loud. Garrett didn't wake up one morning and decide to become the man he turned out to be. It happened the way most things happen, gradually in small choices, each one a little easier than the last because the one before it had already been made. A man who moves company money quietly enough convinces himself it isn't really wrong. A man who keeps a second life tells himself it's temporary, and then one day the whole structure he's built is standing on nothing and he's genuinely surprised when it falls. I don't say this to excuse him. I say it because I think that's the actual mechanics of how people end up where Garrett ended up, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anybody. Pamela, on the other hand, I watched my daughter do something I'm not sure I could have done at her age. When she found those expense reports in September, she didn't panic. She didn't confront Garrett right away and give him the chance to explain things away. She sat with what she'd found. She pulled on the thread carefully and methodically over 3 weeks, and she built a picture of the truth before she did anything with it. That takes a particular kind of steadiness. It takes the willingness to keep looking even when your finding is worse than you expected. Most people stop looking before they get there. She also, and this matters to me more than anything, she kept her head clear about what was actually important. The money was important, yes. Constance on Bay Street made sure she was properly protected, and Pamela let her. But Pamela never lost sight of Owen and Bayer and Arthur. She never let the legal machinery become the point. She knew what she was doing it for. I think about the choices she had. She could have signed the first agreement Garrett's family offered and taken a smaller settlement and been done with it faster. She could have let the whole financial side go and just focused on the kids. She didn't. She stood her ground quietly and without drama because she understood that the ground was worth standing on. Not out of spite, but because her children deserved a mother who hadn't let herself be managed out of what was fair. There's something in that worth remembering. Doing the right thing isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like a woman sitting alone at a kitchen table in September, going through expense reports line by line, deciding to know the truth before she decides what to do with it. I'm 67 now. I've made my own share of mistakes and I've watched people I love make theirs. What I've come to believe is that most of what matters comes down to 3 things. Whether you treat people honestly, whether you're willing to think clearly when thinking clearly is hard, and whether you can hold on when holding on costs you something. Garrett had none of those 3 things when it mattered. Pamela had all of them. The maple table in my kitchen is refinished now. Arthur is going to learn to walk on the floor beside it. That's enough for me.